The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings and welcome to the September 4th, 2019 edition of International ACAC's Webinar Wednesday series. The topic today is the state of admissions. My name is Eric Hyde and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. And we're fortunate to have an outstanding panel of presenters who will introduce themselves in just a moment. But before they do, a couple quick notes about the session. So the first note, this session is being recorded and will later be archived on the International ACAC website. The session does move quickly, so please access the recording if you need to hear something again, or if you just need a refresher about the content, or of course if you want to share it with others. The second piece of housekeeping is that you're going to be asked to participate in the webinar in two ways today. First, you'll be asked to respond to some poll questions. So when the poll appears on your screen, take a moment to select an answer. Okay. The second way you'll be asked to participate is you're invited to ask questions of our panelists. So on your go-to control panel, you will see a little space that says questions. At any time, you're welcome to type a question into that box. It will come to me and I will collect them to present to our panelists at the end of the session. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Megan.
Good evening from Omaha, Nebraska. My name is Megan Mankarian-Stem, and I am the Director of International Enrollment at Creighton University. We are excited to come together tonight to go through this webinar with everybody and talk about the state of admissions and really look at this past recruitment cycle and talk through some trends that we're seeing both anecdotally in our data and what we're expecting for this upcoming year. How are we going to adapt? What things do we need to be prepared for? So before we dive in, I will let the others on the panel introduce themselves as well.
Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. I'm Fiona Reese, and I work at UCLA.
Hi, everybody. I'm Laura Severin. I'm the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Yale and US College in Singapore.
And good morning, everyone. I'm Johanna Fishbein. I'm the head of University Advising at the UW.
Us right now. So if we could go to the next slide.
I may have jinxed us, everyone. Prior to this, I'd said to Eric that we were going to have no technological issues, so clearly I should not have put that out in the universe.
There you go. All right, sorry about that. Hopefully that's our last one. But Megan, I'm guessing you probably just told everyone that we have a poll coming.
Yes.
Yes. All right, so thank you. So we're going to go ahead and launch a couple polls. So now that you know who our presenters are, we would like to know who you are. So who is in the room? If you could go ahead and please select your appropriate role.
And Eric, maybe you can quickly tell people how to do that if they're not familiar.
Yes, so as you can see on your screen, it's going to give you 4 radio buttons. You can go ahead and click on the one that is closest to what represents you. High school counselor, university representative, independent counselor, or other. And it looks like we've got just about everyone in. So we'll go ahead and close that poll and take a look at the results. Okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty good spread for you tonight. Yeah, university representatives leading the way, but not by much. Okay, so before we move on, we'll go through another poll, and we'd like to know, what region are you located in? So please go ahead and select your region. By clicking on the appropriate response. Okay, looks like just about everyone has voted, so we'll go ahead and close that poll and share those results with you. And it looks like we're North America heavy for this session. But it looks like we've got some folks tuning in from all over the world, which is fantastic. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you all for responding. It's nice to know who's here with us. So I'm going to turn it over to Fiona to get started, talk about a little bit of history of the last couple of years, and then move into what we're seeing now.
Sure. So I always think it's helpful to look back over our most recent and perhaps not so recent history, depending on your point of view. So Eric, if you can go to the next slide. It was only a few years ago that, go back just 3 years, that you were reading the press and all of it was about the wonderful international numbers that were coming to the United States and globalism. And I have actually done a panel, as has Johanna and several other members at NACAC, and this actually stemmed from around this time. I was attending a conference, and there was a US university president who fairly boldly stood up and basically said, this interest is never going to die, which I just thought was tremendous hubris and frankly wrong. And so we started doing this panel of, is this bubble really going to burst? And hopefully not by putting it out into the universe, but if you jump to the next slide, you can see that now when you read the press, it's telling a very different story, and it's very much doom and gloom and what is happening to us. And we think that there's some truth to both of these and there's some not so truths in them. So next slide.
And the other trend that we have noticed is that while some universities in the US in particular, applications are decreasing, the universities that are the most selective and tend to have the best and the highest endowments, their applications are either staying stable or increasing. And so it seems to be a case of the haves and have-nots. So in the US in particular, we're noticing small schools are struggling financially. There's starting to be more oversight of finances at the university level. And even in high school visits, students and parents have started asking, what's your endowment like? Are you financially stable? So it's really a divide now between the schools that do have almost unlimited financial assets and those that are worrying at the moment. Next slide, please.
So what caused this? Well, there's a lot of different things at play. Maybe it's the President of the United States. Maybe it's not. Next slide, please. I think there's certainly some real concerns that are out there as far as visa restrictions and potential retaliations that are taking place, that could take place. And I think there's also, from the university side, some real concerns about making sure that you're not too financially dependent on students who are coming from one particular area.
And another thing that I was just telling Fiona yesterday on NPR, there was the Harvard president was interviewed about a student who had had a visa denied and ended up getting it eventually. But the title of the article is Harvard President Expresses Concern About Obstacles Facing Foreign Students or Foreign Scholars. And so that certainly is something we expect we're going to see more of. In that case, the influence of Harvard alum were very, very helpful in sorting that, but there are going to be more of these coming up. And so this is also having implications for, do we advise our students to wipe their social media before coming to the United States, and who is going to get in and who is going to have trouble in trying to predict what that's going to look like. Next slide, please. The other trend that we've noticed, especially on the high school side, is that since the Trump administration, and it's not just Trump, but it's this administration coming in, especially with the US universities, there's been a lot more discussion of if they're located in a blue or red state. And so we notice students and parents asking about that. We notice universities coming in and talking about that. So if they are in a red state, almost justifying to students that it will be safe there, that they have liberal campuses depending on where they are in the world. So this has just become a new criteria or a new thing that is being considered when students look to the US. Next slide, please.
So I would continue to contend that, yes, the current political rhetoric is probably not helpful, but I think sadly there are many other parts of the world that are experiencing this and perhaps are not having the same set of declines. So I think it's very easy to blame it on one single event, but I think we would all agree that there's probably a lot more at play than just that. And frankly, the issues that are perhaps causing students to look elsewhere are running far deeper. And they're really issues that we've got to think very long and hard about. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see likely a downward trend. So what are those other things? Next slide, please.
And here is a list of them. We actually created this list. We did a survey when we presented this topic at NACAC last year, and we were super surprised because we thought Trump was going to be the #1 reason for decreased interest in the US, but it was actually cost and complexity of the application process. So that is something that we need to be aware of. The more easy we make it for students, accessibility there. Other big factors that you can see are no surprise. Safety and security is a huge concern, especially gun violence in the US. And employability after their degree, and even thinking about their OPT time and whether that's going to be an option for them, and whether they'll be able to get their visa. Next slide, please.
Johanna just loves the picture of Justin Trudeau as well.
Love it. I love it. And the biggest, or one of the bigger concerns we also noticed was just the racial climate in the US. And we have noticed this has been a consistent concern since for the last 2 or 3 years. And so especially with the media coverage of this, it is something where students look at this and then are looking to other countries or destinations where they feel more safe. And that is why that Trudeau picture is up there, because Canada is often perceived as a more safe location in North America by many of our students. Next slide, please.
But I think it's really important to, and obviously we've been talking a lot about the US, but it's important to know that it's not just the US. I will say for myself, I'm obviously not in Canada, but I did not see the issue that played out last fall of Saudi students leaving Canada. I will admit that my institution has probably benefited from that. And I actually had one of my VPs come to me and say, hey, great job in Saudi Arabia. Our numbers really went up this past year. And I was like, yeah, we haven't been visiting there in several years, but thank you, I'll take the compliment. I did not. I actually went on to explain why. And I'll talk a little bit more about that education that needs to be done. But you know, there's plenty of other places that are having, as I said, some issues, or it's not just the US that can be perceived as being unwelcoming.
And I was sharing with Fiona earlier that for us, it was very interesting because we were very worried about visas in the US, and none of our students have had a problem with their student visa. But in Canada, we have had visa denials. And so that was something we weren't expecting, and we're trying to learn more about that. So I think there are surprises, and things certainly are very unpredictable at the moment. Next slide. And then we gave, sort of just to wrap things up, that safety is certainly an ongoing concern in the US, as I said. There's a general unease at the moment with students and their families just unsure what to expect. The trade war has also highlighted this unease a bit. And at the moment, we're seeing an impact on grad students being able to get their visas and things like that, but no one knows if that's going to continue. Is that going to trickle down to the undergrad? So again, just trying to predict what that's going to look like is really hard at the moment. Next slide, please.
And since I get to play the role of old timer, thank you very much to my colleagues for that one. I remember being around after the events of September the 11th in the US, and at the time actually I worked for a university, George Washington University in Washington, DC. And so some of these conversations I remember very much being at play at the same time. There were a lot of concerns about coming to the US. Was it going to be safe? There were a lot of visa concerns about how difficult it suddenly became to get visas. And at the same time, the UK and Australian universities had really kicked up their recruiting and what they were doing. Next slide, please. So if you actually go back to that era, you can see that immediately after September the 11th, there was a really significant decline in the number of international students that were coming to the US. And it took about 5 years for that uptick to start to take place. Again, if you proceeded to continue that, it keeps going up for a number of years, and now we're starting to see a decline. I don't know what was going to happen in the future, and that I think is obviously part of the impetus of where are we? Do we think we're going to rebound? Do we think we're going to keep going down? If we do, for how long? And so for that, I think it's probably a good segue to start talking about what we and our institutions have been seeing. So next slide, please. So we're going to just spend a little bit of time going through each of our institutions and what it is that we've been seeing. So next slide, and over to you, Johanna.
Thank you, Fiona. So UWC is a high school. We have about 1,300 students from 80 different countries. In the past, the US was always our most popular destination, and then the UK with a little over a third going to each of those places. And this was the first year for us where we noticed our US matriculations went down. So applications did not, but when we look at who actually enrolled in the US, last year it was 37%, and this year it was 33%. And so that was the first year we've had a noticeable decrease. So we're definitely keeping an eye on that. We also had a very, I think, noticeable increase in Canadian matriculation. So in the past, last year we had 6% of our students enroll, and this year we had 11%. And in Australia, again, last year we had 3% enroll, and then this year we had 6%. So it's those trends that we are talking about historically, we're actually seeing play out now in our student community. We're having to do a lot more education on what the different systems are like. Again, that complexity of applying to the US. So we have a lot of families who are now saying, I only want to go to the US if I get into a good university, and they define good as those named schools that are very, very highly selective. And if they don't get in, they will go to the UK, Australia, or somewhere else where the cost is lower, the degree is shorter, something like that. So we're having to have a lot more conversations about the value of the US education, and also about that we don't, while we always encourage our students to, if they want to, apply to multiple countries, that this idea of just applying to the US for a few highly selective names is not a good strategy. We also are noticing, as I said already, a real increase in visa concerns. It's come up in every parent talk we did. We just had a grade 11 talk yesterday, and it came up as a question. And so that's something that we're trying to be more proactive about addressing, and we're getting a lot more questions about employment. So will my child be able to work, and what will that look like once they graduate? So I think overall our families are becoming much more cost aware, even families that in the past might not have thought about cost, but also much more aware of where they're going to be able to work and what they're going to be able to do with their degree. Next slide, please. These are just a few more trends that we're noticing, and I think it's probably fairly common across the high school side. We're noticing a huge increase in STEM and STEAM majors, and I know the universities are seeing this as well, because when they come visit, they say their computer science courses are maxed out. And the reason is it's students. I have a student who loves English and wants to be a writer, but she is applying for computer science despite my best efforts, and that is because her parents think it's going to be a better option for when she graduates, and because she can get the 3-year OPT time after leaving the US. So these are things that we're seeing, and we're trying really hard to encourage students to pursue their love of the humanities and other subjects, but at the moment it's proving to be a bit of a losing battle. We are noticing our students are now doing multiple application cycles. So whereas in the past it used to be they would apply and then go to university, this year we have at least 4 students, possibly more, who got into fantastic universities but have decided they want to try their luck again. And so that has implications for caseload. It has big implications for student well-being as well. And so we're really trying to work with our community about the importance of that whole Frank Bruni idea of where you go is not who you'll be, that actually starting your first degree, it will be a valuable experience no matter where you do it. As I said, there's a big increase in global options, especially for the US, where it used to be you had to go to the US for liberal arts. There are tons of global options for that now. So it's really quite interesting and fun to keep up with where all those are and where our students are going. And a big trend we are noticing is honesty in applications continues to be a concern. In this part of the world, it's very common that our students will sometimes work with an independent counselor, and we know there are some fantastic independent counselors out there, but there are some not so fantastic ones as well. And so how to really educate our community about what is an authentic application, and to make sure that they don't have this approach that it's worth whatever it takes to get into some of these schools. And so we're noticing a lot more of that. This past summer, we saw 2 students having their essays written for them on a Google Doc that they had shared with their college counselor. And so we're doing our best to address this, but I think it's a trend that we're going to see more of as that desperation increases for some specific schools. Next slide, please. And now I think it's going to go over to Fiona, who's going to tell you a little bit about what they're seeing on the university side.
And I think, Johanna, your point is we're seeing the same thing too. And one could argue that Varsity Blues kind of points to that. So next slide, I'm just going to briefly run through some of the trends for UCLA. One of the joys of being at a public institution is that all of this information is public record, so it is quite easy for me to share. So if you go back to 95, you can see our trend. You can see that there were times where we dipped, there were times, but overall the trajectory has generally been the same until this past year. So what does that mean? Next slide, please. Just to drill down into these numbers a little bit more, you can see the breakdown for the last 5 years of our freshman applicants. The blue are California, the gold are out of state, and the gray are our international numbers, because we do break them down in that sense. And what is it that's causing this? Your guess is probably as good as mine. The unusual year. One could argue that we're going to be seeing a decrease as we move forward. Kind of makes sense that as you become more competitive, and with our insane application numbers as it is, maybe we're losing students who are not even applying to us because they're basically saying, I know I'm not going to get in. It could just be that it's the cost of education, and this is absurd for me to say. Our total cost for everything is about $65,000 a year. So I have actually had international families say to me, wow, that's a bargain. I don't know how $65,000 a year is a bargain, but I can sort of see where they're coming from in that. And it also leads me to my third point, and the next slide perhaps is going to help illustrate that. So we can go to the next slide. And this is just the US. I did a little bit of research and I couldn't actually find easily the world's birth rates. But if you look and you can see for 2000, you actually see that there was a little bit of a birth spike in the year 2000, which would correlate to the year of 2018. That if you can remember, if any of you really remember that time, there was actually a little bit of a birth bump around the millennium because people wanted to have new babies in the new millennium. So is it that we're just actually replicating the birth decrease that occurred? And as you'll see, it actually declines for a couple of years before we start to go back up. So maybe that's what we're going to see. Next slide, please. Having said that, and this is probably more a factor of numbers than anything else, but this is our admit rates, again, for the last 8 years. You can see the general trends. I think it's really far more important to note that while you have varying admit rates between our various groups, it's actually got nothing to do with being more or less selective for different groups and everything to do with our yield rates. But you can see that all have generally gone down over that time frame. So next slide, please. And for our yield, this is where things start to be a little funky. That anybody who is in enrollment management will tell you that it is an art and it is a science. The science is that you look at your history, and the art is that generally as you become more competitive and as your admit rates go down, one would assume that your yield would actually go down as well. That basically you are vying for more competitive students who have more options, either as far as where you're competing against, or that students are getting scholarships from peer institutions. And if we keep talking about the cost of admission, one would assume that that would factor in more and more. But the last few years seem to go against that phase, so it makes it a little bit harder to predict. Next slide. And this is really just for everybody's understanding that because we are a state and an institution for California, obviously the bulk of our students are coming from the state of California. So this is actually what the makeup looks like. And that 25% is a combination of out-of-state and international students. It's pretty close to 50-50 mix. Next slide, please. And this, I think probably the biggest takeaway for everyone is the number of students who are applying with a perfect 4.0. And I share that because it goes up every year. And I think it gets to the idea of grade inflation and not actually our selectivity. And we could go down a whole different road of what that means. But I think, again, it gets into that conversation of how we're trying to predict student success when the biggest piece of your academic puzzle and your backbone of your application is essentially changing constantly. And then throw the mastery transcript in and standard-based grading. And again, we've got an entire new session, but I just wanted to share that. Next slide, please. One other trend I wanted to share with you that we are seeing is that we have actually, even last year, continued to see an increase in the number of transfer applications. Now, one could argue that that is partly due to, as you become more selective, more students are going to look to transfer into you, and I think that's a little bit at play. But at least within the US, I also think that that gets to changing demographics as well as the cost of education. That especially for within California, you can spend 2 years at a California community college. It is going to cost you way less and still graduate. And at the end, your bachelor's degree is from a different institution. So I think that's important to note. Next slide, please. And with that, that concludes the UCLA section. And so over to the other side of the world, and Laura, to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Fiona. You all may have noticed I've been cutting in and out. I'm in an Airbnb and I'm trying to chase the light. I didn't realize how dark this room was going to be, so apologies if you can't see me very well. So again, my name is Laura Severin. I'm the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Yale and US College. For those unfamiliar, Yale and US is a relatively new institution. We opened in 2013. And as our name would suggest, we are a partnership between Yale University and the National University of Singapore. And the basic idea behind the college is to offer what is often deemed to be an American-style liberal arts education in Singapore, catered to a very international student body with a very globally focused curriculum. So our enrollment is just 1,000 students. We're bringing in 250 students a year. And as you can imagine, this is the 7th class we enrolled this year. Trends for us are pretty significant from year to year. We don't have the luxury of the long history that Fiona's been able to share with us at UCLA. But interestingly, some of the trends that we've seen and some of the shifts we've seen, some of them play in with a little bit of what Fiona has talked about and Johanna as well. So if you look back just a couple of years, we've seen significant application growth, 17% growth over the last 4 years. But interesting, that growth was mirrored in just 1 year. So at the point between 2018 and 2019, where UCLA was seeing a slight reduction in applications, our application pool, particularly from international students, has grown significantly. Of note, of course, because we're in Singapore, Singaporeans are domestic students, and anyone outside of Singapore is what we consider to be international, including American students. And we're seeing significant growth of American students who are looking for opportunities outside the US. We have the luxury of a shared application platform with Yale. And in the beginning years, a lot of students were intrigued by this notion of this college in Singapore, but maybe not very serious about their interest. And that has changed significantly over the past 6 or 7 years, where more and more students from the US are actively seeking us as an institution, wanting to explore opportunities for higher education outside of the US. So not only are we seeing the demographics changing in terms of international students going into the US, I think we're starting to see what will be continued growth in a number of American students leaving the country for higher education. So that's something that's certainly on our minds and that we're tracking very closely. When I was thinking about overall trends to talk about tonight, one of the things that really has been on my mind as I think about ensuring that we enroll the number of students that we need to is MELT and the huge role that MELT plays. For us, as I said, we're bringing in 250 students a year. So if we MELT 5 or 10 students, that's significant to us. And coming in 1 or 2 students above or below targets is significant. I think probably Fiona would tell you if 1 or 2 students didn't show at UCLA, it wouldn't be noticed, or just be a small drop in the bucket.
Whereas great, yeah.
Yeah, for us this is significant. So this year in particular of note, we had 5 international students who didn't show with no notice. And again, that number 5 might seem small, but you're talking about half of our students are international, so 125 international students. 5 who don't show with no notice is significant. Now this is on top of the MELT that we saw in the months coming into matriculation. Students notifying us they've been taken off the wait list elsewhere. Offers came in from other parts of the world. Oftentimes we're losing students to the UK because they're waiting for those offers and their IB results to know exactly where they're going. So these 5 students in particular had gone through the entire process with us. They had secured student visas. They had done all of their housing paperwork. Every indication until the day of orientation was that they were going to appear. And when they didn't, it took, in some cases, up to 10 days for me to actually track them down and find out that they weren't coming. And of course, this is sort of an age-old issue, right, where students are applying to multiple countries with different systems, different dates. And something I know that those folks on the counseling side are constantly counseling their students into notifying universities as soon as they can. But I was really struck by the number of students who were not taking that advice and or were coming from institutions or high schools where they didn't have that advice. So in terms of sitting on the side of being responsible for how many people actually arrive on campus for the start of the year, this is something that I'm really concerned about. We've seen double depositing. We're hearing about triple depositing. You have some parts of the world where there is no deposit required. Singapore being one of them. Our students don't have to pay an enrollment deposit. So for them not to show, there's no skin off their back, right? It's just, well, I said I was going to go and now I'm not. And so the frequency with which this happens, and I think will continue to happen as students are watching political climates around the world, while finances and currency fluctuations are a big issue. Students this year from Pakistan are facing a lot of issue with currency fluctuation, and so what might have been feasible for them 5 months ago is no longer feasible for them. And so these are things that we all need to be aware of when we're working towards having students actually show up. So the next slide, Johanna talked a little bit earlier about the number of options that exist for students outside of the US. For us, sitting in Asia and offering an English language liberal arts program in Asia sounds very unique and very interesting. And then you look at some of these fantastic options that exist, and it's not that unique. And for us, that means competition, which I think is good. It's healthy competition. For students, it means more options. And more options that might take them away from some of their more traditional choices, like going to Australia, the UK, Canada, the US. All of a sudden, studying in China or in the Middle East is becoming much easier, much more accessible, and access to information about these schools is increasing as well. I'll go to the next slide. And China, I think it's important for us to talk about China. So many of us rely on China in terms of our enrollment plans. The age-old question of will the China bubble burst remains to be seen, right? I think certain institutions are seeing fluctuations in numbers of Chinese students, but what's happening now is more and more international students, non-Chinese students, are going to China for education. And this is something that has become attractive for students, and the Chinese are becoming very pragmatic about that as China is building more and more ties around the world in terms of building infrastructure and economic ties. Students from many countries are seeing China as a good place to build a foundation and to build a network. And so you can see a quote here from a student from Myanmar who said, "I want to go to China because I know that if I have that experience in China, it will serve me well in finding a job at home when I come back." And so whereas we oftentimes, I think about China as a producer of students, they're now becoming, to a very large extent, a provider of international options for our students. And for many of us, my background being in the US, it's something I would be concerned about if I were in the US as well, not only because I'm in Asia would I be thinking about this. So I think there's a shift in terms of how we need to think about major players in the field, in the market, beyond just providing students to us, but what competition are they creating for us as well. And with that, I will pass it to, I can't remember who's next.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself as me. And I think I'm just going to lead into we're going to share a little bit about things we're expecting, following up from Laura, things to just be thinking about as we go into this recruitment cycle. So next slide, please. So something we're expecting a lot about, so I think this has high school and university implications, is that the Varsity Blues scandal has been very big, especially in our parent community. So it's definitely on our parents' minds. There's a general distrust of the US system that we're trying to address head on, and we're using universities who visit to help us do that. Things seem a bit more murky than they used to. And so things like athletic recruitment, development, we're having to do a lot more of addressing that head on. So with parents coming in and saying, how much do I need to give, and things like that, whereas in the past, I don't think they would have been quite as blatant about asking. And so that is something we're certainly going to see more of on the high school side. And Laura, do you want to talk a little bit about this one from the university side?
Yeah, it's interesting. There was a degree to which when the scandal broke, I thought, oh, thank goodness I'm not in the US. I work at an institution outside the US. I'm not touched by this. And shortly thereafter, I was reminded that that's not true when the Ministry of Education, which oversees everything education based in Singapore, came knocking on my door and said, what are you doing to prevent fraud? What are you doing to identify inauthentic applications? What processes do you have in place? And thankfully, we were able to respond in great detail about the steps that we take, everything from, of course, receiving scores from official organizations, the communication that we have with our counseling peers. But it became very clear to me that this is something that all of us ought to have written down as policy. If you don't already, I think that it's something that you and your admission colleagues ought to think about putting pen to paper. In terms of what are the steps that you take, not only to prevent fraud, but when in those cases where you're faced with fraud in applications, how do you address that? What steps are taken, whether it be communication with the student, with the counselors, with the principals of high schools? What steps are you as an institution prepared to take should you find yourself in hot water? And I think remembering that hot water doesn't need to be something at the scale of the Varsity Blues scandal, but that just in everyday applications, as Johanna said, she's seeing more students who are seeking help that borders on maybe some unethical practices, and be willing to share those out.
Yeah, and I'll just add, even on the high school side, we're changing the guidelines our students sign. We've always said they have to be honest in their applications, but we're going to be a lot more clear on what that honesty looks like for that exact same reason. So I do think that idea of just writing things down and making sure policies are clear is really important. Eric, how you doing on, can you advance the slide? Are you okay? It's hard to see this one, but this is quick. It's just another thing we're definitely expecting to see more of is discussion about F1 visas in the US. This is an article from last week that said, are the foreign student visa issuance is down 40%. And to be clear, we don't know if this is happening because they're harder to get or if just fewer students are applying for the visas because they don't share the number of students who actually apply for them. But this is just something we certainly expect to see more of, more coverage of it in the news and just more of a discussion with families. Next slide. And so what are we doing about it? So I've sort of talked a little bit about what we're doing as I go, but I'll just, we're definitely addressing it head on as much as we can, some of these new trends. So we are doing new presentations for students and our families. We did one last year on who gets in and why to the highly selective universities. We had never done it before. We noticed there were a lot of independent counseling agencies running workshops like this in Singapore, and we figured we should address it head on. And we basically just shared the unpredictability and the complexity of the process. And then we've had other universities come in and really complement this, like USC came and just shared some really helpful data with our families that just show them how hard it is to predict. And I think so getting universities to come in and help with that messaging has been really valuable because we all know that sometimes they just need to hear it from your wonderful university perspectives before they believe it's true. We're also doing a workshop today for the first time on the return on investment of liberal arts education because we're trying to use the family's language to kind of to meet them where they are. So we will see how that goes, but so we're doing a lot more of new programming just to really address some of these trends. For the first time that I've been in Singapore, the U.S. Embassy reached out to us to collaborate with us on visa workshops. So we're going to be doing that this year for the first time. So I think the U.S. Embassy is really around the world are hopefully more proactive in helping guide students through the process. We're working hard to highlight like new pathways. So thinking beyond just getting that STEM degree and going right into work, what are some different routes students can take and highlighting success. We had a bunch of slides scrolling that showed students who did not go to the big name universities, but who went on to do PhDs and masters at those famous universities, just to reassure our parents a little bit. We've noticed there's new search criteria students are using, so we're trying to meet them with that. So they want to look at things like sustainability, employment, co-ops, all of that. We're working to highlight university options, of course, beyond those famous ones. And we're really overall just looking to engage our parents more because we used to sort of keep the parents out and really we still want the students to take ownership of the process, but we realize we need to get our parents and our larger community on board as well. And one other thing we've done is we've added a section to our presentations on trends in higher education. So trends like the ones being discussed today, we actually share with our students and families so that they can make more informed decisions for them. Next slide. In terms of ongoing concerns that we have, as I said, as Laura actually brought up, this whole idea of trying to police students and parents who double deposit is really hard. We noticed this summer that even with students holding UK and US offers, we had to email and call them multiple times before we say they have to CC us on their notification to the university, and they were just so hesitant to do it. I don't think they have bad intent. I just think there's nervousness about the unpredictability, especially in the US. So a lot of our students wanted to hold on to that in case they didn't get their visa. And so as I said, we're trying to update our guidelines and educate our community about why they really can't do this. But I do see it as something that's going to continue being really hard to monitor. As I said, we see it as an ongoing concern, this honesty in applications. And for the US, there's only so much we can control. We can't actually see what they submit. For the UK, we can. So for the UK, we can absolutely make sure it's an authentic application, but for other parts of the world, it's much harder. And so we're just going to see that as something we're going to be addressing as much as we can. And another ongoing concern on the high school side is just general equity for international students, especially in the US admissions process. Standardized testing is still not equal for international students. They're not equal test dates. There are no fee waivers still for ACT for international students. The financial aid isn't equitable. So I think some of these inequities will continue to be a concern, especially for our students looking to study in the US. Now I will turn over to Fiona.
I'll be briefer if I can unmute myself. Couple key things that we are trying to do. One is, I talked about it briefly, and that is managing expectations. A big part of that is managing the expectations of my boss and my boss's boss and my boss's boss's boss about what's happening within the world. That sort of, as I said at the beginning, you can't just assume that international students are automatically going to show up. And also very much educating my peers in the office so that they are aware of what's happening. As far as what we're doing is recruitment, it's that give and take of wanting to focus on your bread and butter, excuse me, but also needing to make sure that you're developing new markets. We've all got limited resources, so how do you try and balance all of that out? Then once you do get the applications, how are you actually reviewing them? And again, this gets to sort of the managing the process of what does a good student mean in that particular region and that educational system, that they're not always going to look exactly like what previous applicants have looked like from other parts of the world. I've talked about the pros and cons of yield. Where I think you're going to see that really play out is that more of us are having to rely even more heavily on our wait list. That we don't have the flexibility to massively over-enroll, but we also don't want to under-enroll, so that's where you use the wait list. The other thing that I am seeing is the number of students who are significantly missing their external exam results, IB, A-levels, and that trend just seems to keep getting worse every year. I think my biggest takeaway is that, much like we've been talking about application, sort of making sure that it's honest, I'm actually seeing it being an issue with high schools. That high schools think, especially if you're applying to the US, it really doesn't matter, so we're just going to inflate everything by a grade, or if you're between a 5 or a 6, we're going to say that you're going to get a 6, because we have seen more and more students who are missing their IBs, for example, by more than 5 points, and A levels by sort of each has gone down by a grade. And so we are actually building that into our summer melt models, that we just need to be able to sort of reinforce the integrity of our process. And then the last thing I would say is sort of that feedback loop of going to conferences. I myself try and get out and do yield. I'll try and do, we try and have continuity in who's traveling. My colleague who travels to China, this year I was like, I need you on the ground. I need you to be telling me what you're seeing this year versus last year versus 2 years ago, because I need to have an understanding of how much of that managing expectations I need to be doing now before we get to applications and before we're trying to predict our yield. So I just think that that's really important. So next slide, and Laura, for you.
Great. So I'll try to be brief here. A few things that are weighing heavily on my mind as we venture into this next cycle. One is, I think we all take pride in having diversity on our campuses, and we use it as an attractive point for prospective students. How do you manage that and having sort of the international diversity you want versus the potential, and sometimes this comes from leadership from boards, of saying, well, why don't you just get more full-pay students from XYZ country? And XYZ country, for many of us, probably are the exact same, maybe just in varying orders. So weighing that challenge and having that battle with our bosses and our bosses' bosses and the presidents about what should the makeup of your international body look like. I think this is something that will continue to be a challenge. One of the developments since I've started in this profession is more and more programs designed for, you'll see there, Holly students, high achieving, low income students, which is fantastic. We have more students who are getting support through the admission process, more students who are going through prep programs for things like the SATs, for what does a common application look like, for submitting their essays. But the low income part of that acronym creates challenge where there are still a small number of institutions that worldwide that can provide funding that many of these students need. And so it's increasing competition amongst these incredibly talented students, the type of students that many of us want on our campuses, but with economic flow being what it is, international financial aid budgets are oftentimes staying the same, if not shrinking, while this increase in demand is growing. And so navigating that, again, in terms of institutional priorities is of interest. The use of merit scholarships in terms of yield, Fiona has talked a lot about yield, which I think is really important. We experimented a little bit this year and cut our merit spending considerably, and I was really nervous about doing it. And we saw no negative impact on our yield. In fact, our yield went up this year despite the fact that we spent less on merit. So there when I was talking to my boss and saying I'm really nervous about doing this, I had to eat my words and go back and say, well, that worked out really well. Now, will that continue to work well? We don't know. But how do we all use the limited funding that we have to our best advantage? And my last point there is very similar to what Fiona's just talked about with students who are not achieving the level of success that we anticipate based on their applications with their IB. And this is an ongoing conversation with our counseling colleagues. What do we do in those cases? And we've had some really interesting conversations at various conferences about this, where there are those in the campus saying students shouldn't be held accountable for their predicted scores if they're looking at schools in the US or that are following a more holistic model. There are counselors who are saying, please rescind the offer. When you see that this has happened, rescind, rescind, rescind. This is the only way that we can drive the point home to our students that final performance counts. Of course, from the enrollment side, while that sounds like a viable option, there's also concerns on that. All of a sudden your melt is increasing because you've had to pull offers and you're worried about filling spots and having every bed and seat taken in your class. Concerns about destroying the relationship that you've worked to build with schools. And of course, social media chatter. Anything we do gets out there very quickly. So if you've rescinded offers, is that going to affect your application numbers the subsequent years, where students are saying, if I don't perform just as they want me to, I'm going to end up having my offer rescinded, so maybe I don't even want to apply to that institution. So finding a way to navigate that, I think, will be a continuous challenge for all of us, and something that I anticipate we'll be discussing at future conferences with much more detail. And with that, I will turn things over to Megan to wrap us up.
So as many of us start to hit the road, or if you're like me, I'm already back from one trip on the road this fall, we're already thinking about all of these impacts that have happened over the last year and how is this going to affect us today or tomorrow. So in one thing that I have really noticed, especially over the last year, is the increased competition. When we were leading up to 2016, a lot of the competition on the road was a lot of US universities. And a lot of it was, a lot of universities trying to make an impact on their budget. And by enrolling more international students, it was kind of a silver bullet to help them financially. But now a lot of US institutions really are looking to help fill seats as the US market continues to decline, but also this huge growing global competition with more universities throughout Canada, Europe, Singapore, Hong Kong, China, private schools in India, Australia, really competing for the same number of students. And how do we use this to our advantage, or how are we supporting students in this process? One of the things that I'm excited to see in some regions is how high schools are learning to change the school visits, where it's not so much going and doing a fare-based model where, you know, a student walks in, and now at some of these fairs, there's upwards to 180 different institutions from around the world. And when we're all handing out booklets with very similar photos, very similar statistics, what is this really doing for students, but also how is it helping institutions really try to find students of best fit? So for a lot of these high schools that are doing new activities where we're looking at, you know, for example, one of the presentations that I've done is careers in the health sciences, with so many students thinking, well, I want to go study and be a doctor, without realizing that there's really this huge field in healthcare, and what can we really do? But, you know, how are high schools also trying to combat these 200 or 300 plus visit requests that they're getting per year? But really, at the end of the day, how are we all really serving our students in this? Other issues that I've already come across, and I know others have as well, is just in terms of safety intentions, in terms of travel. So many colleagues are heading off to Southeast Asia in the next month, and with all of the protests in Hong Kong, how is this affecting our layovers and connections, or just being in Hong Kong in general? I know I personally had an issue booking flights last month just to go to India. My normal pathway costs over $1,000 more than I'd ever paid in the past because of the airspace closure over India and Pakistan right now, with the tension with Kashmir, as well as the airspace closure over Iran because of the US tension there. So I bit the bullet, added 12 hours onto my travel day, but flew the other direction around the world basically to save $1,000. Because on the university side, we do have very defined budgets that we have to work within. And that kind of leads to my last point, as many institutions, especially in the US, are putting pressure on enrollment managers to really keep, maintain, or increase the number of international students, but decreasing our budgets at the same time. And so really looking at new ways to recruit, combat the decreasing US high school demographics as well. So, but at the end of the day, how are we using these things in all of these ideas as we're coming up into these next months and really running into this new recruitment cycle? So we'll quickly lead into our last poll of for those of you on the university side.
Megan, why don't we go ahead and skip the poll given the timing, and just go straight to general questions.
Perfect.
And I think perhaps we're all okay to stay on for a few more minutes, just to make sure that we can at least get a couple questions in. Sorry, you're dealing with a bunch of admission people, and
we love to talk.
Excellent. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Great. Good. Well, thank you for that. Was fantastic information. Really beautifully presented. And we do have a couple of questions. So one very timely one. Can you talk a bit how NACAC's proposed changes to the CEPP and the bylaws may create challenges for this recruitment cycle?
Should I start?
Yeah.
So I guess to briefly explain, there are essentially 4 votes that are up at NACAC. 3 of them are proposed changes to the Code of Ethics, and then the 4th is related to, there could be further changes, we don't know, is somebody who sits on the NACAC Board of Directors. And so trying to give the board authority under extreme circumstances to make changes as needed. Really, those changes are somewhat anyone's guess. And I guess I would say a few things. One of which is that universities may change the way they do things, they may not. That it is with the idea of trying to give students, one could argue, increased competition, that if a university wants to go back and say, hey, we can offer you more money, that they have that ability to do so. I do think that will probably it could make it a little bit harder. It could extend the process. One could also argue that is already happening, and that's been some of the conversation that we've already been talking about with Laura, talking about students who just don't show up, that have done all of the indications. So it's still too early to say exactly how things will play out. I have also said that there are other, if you look at other organizations, if you look at other businesses within the United States, you have something like the Better Business Bureau, where you've got consumers who are basically saying whether they had a positive or negative experience, and they don't have a code of ethics. So there are potentially other ways within that are not considered to be antitrust, but we don't know yet, and we can't know until we know what we can do with the Department of Justice. So that is at least a brief overview. I don't know if Laura, Johanna, Megan, any of you want to add.
No, I would just say that I don't think there'll be any immediate change in this recruitment cycle, right? Whatever happens is going to take a little while to roll out, I think, before people understand what they can do. But I guess we don't know. So in answer to that,
that's actually a very good question.
We don't know. Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Thanks for starting us off with an easy one, Eric.
I only read what's typed into the question boxes, right? So this one perhaps is a little bit more abstract, but as administrators, all of these, all the things that you presented today are sort of involve putting out fires, addressing problems, addressing issues. So as you're spending time focusing on these issues, do you feel that's taking time away from other aspects of your jobs? And if so, what would those be? If not, how are you managing to juggle everything? Do you have any advice for the folks out there? Another easy one.
I think from go ahead, Megan.
Okay. So I have actually spent the last week trying to write out basically a strategic plan for my VP of what my next 1 to 3 years may look like. And I will say it's been very tough because so much of what we have to do right now is very reactionary to things that are out of our control. And really trying to figure out what strategies have I either started to put in place or can I start putting in place now that may still be effective in the next 2 to 3 years. And it's not easy, but I think there are things that we can do now to really benefit ourselves in the future. But that being said, a lot of what I do feel like I've been focusing on is very reactionary to things that are happening, or even being on the road the last couple of weeks and the types of questions that families are asking now. It's not so much, questions about our specific universities, but it's almost that we are ambassadors to the US and really talking about the issues of safety or Trump and H-1B and OPT and those types of things. And so there have been shifts, which, have taken away of traditional recruitment. But I think there are things that we can do that really continue to set us up for a better future.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add, I actually think this is what enrollment managers have always done. And is we have to react to trends that we're seeing, to students' decision-making process change. And so the challenges that we face today might be different than what we faced 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But I wouldn't say that it's any different in scope, really. This is sort of this is what makes it fun, is that we never know what's going to be coming towards us, and there's so many different factors that play into successfully enrolling your class. So I guess my short answer to that is no, I don't feel like it's taking away from other things, because this is sort of what I think I'm meant to be doing.
My only thing that I would add as far as tips are to keep educating yourself, whatever that cliche is about history repeating itself. There's a lot that we can learn from history, and so trying to understand, and then, as I said, sort of that managing up, just like Megan was saying, of educating your bosses and your bosses' bosses, and knowing that it is a never-ending process in a good way. But as Laura said, that's the exciting stuff, I think.
Excellent. Thank you for those perspectives. Well, I'm happy to say that many of the other questions that came in were actually answered at different parts of your presentation. Questions that came in early were answered later on in the presentation, so wonderful job. I think with that, since we've kept our panelists and our attendees over by a few minutes, we want to thank you all for sticking around. Thank you, panelists, for some wonderful information. Thank you, attendees, for listening and absorbing this wonderful information. And just a quick reminder that we will be having our next webinar Wednesday on October 2nd. So less than a month away, we will be discussing financial aid, a deep dive into the US and an overview of some other countries. So thank you again to the panelists. There are lots of comments coming in expressing their thanks as well. So thank you for the wonderful information. As a reminder, this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on the International ACAC website shortly. So with that, we will say goodbye for now. Bye-bye.
Night. Good morning.